In the small, war-ravaged village of Annenberg, nestled deep within the heart of German-occupied France, an eerie calm had settled over the streets. The once vibrant community, now weathered and broken, had seen the horrors of the Second World War unfold around them. As the world beyond their borders raged in chaos, Annenberg had become a microcosm of that devastation. People moved through the town with a kind of mechanical precision, their eyes hollow with fear, their steps tentative, as if any sudden movement might draw the wrath of the Nazi forces that had long claimed dominion over them. The villages and towns that dotted the French countryside were nothing more than pawns in a larger game, where survival itself had become an act of defiance. The tension had been building for weeks, a quiet undercurrent that grew steadily stronger with each passing day. The German forces, led by their merciless officers, had used Annenberg as a strategic point along their supply lines. While the people had once greeted their presence with a fragile tolerance, they now looked upon the occupying soldiers with nothing short of contempt. Stories of atrocities, of families wiped out in the dead of night, of entire villages burned to the ground in the wake of some imagined insult, spread like wildfire through the local population. There were few in Annenberg who hadn't lost someone close, and the war had carved deep scars into the very fabric of the community. Yet, for all the bitterness and rage that simmered beneath the surface, no one dared to speak openly of rebellion. Fear, the greatest of all oppressors, held them in check. It was on a cold winter's morning that news arrived. The British forces, marching south with momentum from recent victories, were approaching Annenberg. Their goal was simple: locate and eliminate a high-ranking Nazi officer hiding within the town. The whispers among the villagers were immediate and intense. The man they sought was none other than Heinrich Schmidt, a name spoken only in hushed tones, if at all. Schmidt was known for his brutal tactics, his unyielding cruelty, and the trail of bodies he left in his wake. He had orchestrated massacres in neighboring villages, led raids that had claimed the lives of countless innocent civilians, and had gained a reputation as one of the most feared officers in the Nazi regime. The people of Annenberg, still reeling from the memories of those very massacres, found themselves caught in a moral quandary. The idea of the British forces arriving, of delivering swift and sure justice to Schmidt, filled many with a sense of grim satisfaction. There was no love for the Nazis here, no pity for those who had brought such pain and suffering to their doors. The thought of retribution, of a reckoning finally being delivered to the man responsible for so much death, was a beacon of hope in an otherwise hopeless world. But the villagers were also wary. The British forces, though hailed as liberators by many, had their own way of waging war. There was a brutal pragmatism to their tactics, a willingness to sacrifice in the name of victory. What would the arrival of the British truly mean for Annenberg? Would it bring the salvation they desperately craved, or would it be another chapter in their endless cycle of violence? In the town square, the mood was one of anxious anticipation. Word spread like wildfire that the British soldiers were drawing nearer. Families locked their doors and shutters, and the elderly huddled close to the hearths in their homes. Those who still had the strength to walk made their way to the square, where they would wait, anxious, trembling, and uncertain, until the fateful moment arrived. The crowd was a strange mix of emotions, a congregation united not by hope, but by an almost desperate yearning for some form of resolution, any resolution. Some were eager for vengeance, their minds already picturing the suffering Schmidt might endure at the hands of the British soldiers. Others, however, felt an unease, as though this moment would change them in ways they could not yet understand. Colonel William Hargrave, commander of the British forces advancing upon Annenberg, stood at the head of his unit, surveying the town from the crest of a nearby hill. The cold air bit at his face as he watched the smoke rise in the distance, signs of life and death intermixed. He was a man hardened by the war, his body bearing the marks of countless battles fought across Europe. His eyes, however, still carried the weight of humanity, a reminder of the man he had once been before the war had stripped him of all illusions. The mission was clear: find Schmidt, capture him, and extract vital intelligence from him regarding the Nazi command structure. There was no room for hesitation, no space for mercy. War was a machine that demanded sacrifices, and Hargrave had long accepted that reality. Yet, as he surveyed the village below, something in him stirred, a feeling he could not quite place. There was a sense of wrongness in the air, an unsettling undercurrent that gnawed at his conscience. Perhaps it was the sight of the villagers, standing like ghosts in the square, their faces a mixture of fear, hatred, and sorrow. Perhaps it was the realization that the violence they had endured had created a world where mercy seemed an impossibility, a foreign concept. It had been too long since he had allowed himself to pause and consider the humanity of those on the other side. War had taught him to see only enemies, not people. Yet now, standing on the edge of this town, he found himself questioning that singular view. Was it possible that the very thing he had come to fight against, blind violence, was also something he had become complicit in? Hargrave's officers, sharp-eyed and efficient, were already formulating their plan. Schmidt was a priority target, and his capture was essential to the success of the Allied push into Nazi-occupied territory. The mission was to be swift and decisive. They would storm the town, find Schmidt, and bring him to justice. Yet, Hargrave hesitated. He knew that a simple act of capture could turn into something far darker, something that might fuel the very cycle of violence the Allies were trying to break. There were no easy answers, and the weight of that knowledge pressed heavily on him. Back in the town square, the tension was mounting. The villagers were a mixture of anxious anticipation and quiet dread. They had seen enough war to understand that nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. The arrival of the British could bring liberation, or it could bring more bloodshed, more loss. Some in the crowd hoped for a brutal retaliation, a chance to see their tormentors suffer for all the pain they had caused. But there were others, those who had witnessed the horrors firsthand, who had seen enough blood to last a lifetime. They feared that the violence would never end, that the cycle of hatred and revenge would consume them all. As the first British soldiers appeared on the outskirts of the town, the crowd grew silent. The tension in the air was palpable, as if time itself had slowed down. Hargrave, riding at the head of his unit, was acutely aware of the weight of his decision. He could feel the eyes of the villagers upon him, their hopes and fears resting on his next move. Would he lead them into another round of violence, or would he find a way to break the cycle? In that moment, everything hung in the balance. The villagers, trembling in their uncertainty, looked to the British soldiers not just for liberation, but for something more, something they hadn't dared hope for, mercy. As the British forces made their way into Annenberg, the atmosphere within the village shifted once more, the air thick with a blend of fear and reluctant anticipation. The sound of marching boots reverberated down the narrow, cobbled streets, an undeniable signal of the presence of the enemy, though to some, the British soldiers no longer seemed like enemies. They were a force of hope, the promise of something different, something better. Yet, as they approached the square, the reality of their mission began to set in, a mission that, despite their noble intentions, would demand a heavy cost. Colonel William Hargrave, leading his unit into the heart of the village, couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. 4 months now, he had been nothing more than a cog in the larger war machine, following orders without question, without hesitation. But this time, it was different. His eyes scanned the village square, where the trembling crowd awaited what they believed would be the long-awaited justice for their suffering. He could see their faces, grief-stricken, worn from months of occupation, yet there was something more there, something that caught him off guard. Perhaps it was the faintest glimmer, but it was there nonetheless, nestled among the faces of those who had seen their lives turned upside down by the war. The task was simple in theory: locate Schmidt, the Nazi officer hiding in the town, and capture him for interrogation. Hargrave had long since been conditioned to see such missions as a matter of logistics: get in, find the target, and neutralize the threat. No emotions. No questions. It was a matter of military protocol, a game of chess in which the lives of civilians were often treated as mere pawns. But here, in this small town, with its scattered, anxious populace, things felt different. The stakes had never seemed so personal. As the soldiers moved deeper into the village, Hargrave's mind began to turn inward. He had seen death up close many times before, on the battlefield, in the chaos of aerial bombardments, and in the eyes of those who had suffered loss beyond measure. But this This was something else entirely. This was not just the cold, clinical mission of wartime. This was the potential for an act of brutal justice that could either burn away the hatred or fuel it for generations to come. And as Hargrave's boots crunched against the icy ground, he found himself questioning whether he could bear to continue down the path of unquestioned violence that had led him to this point. He had heard the rumors about Schmidt long before arriving in Annenberg. Schmidt's name had become synonymous with cruelty, a name that stirred up violent memories in the hearts of those who had suffered under his command. From the moment he had assumed command in the region, Schmidt had earned a reputation for his swift and merciless actions, often punishing entire towns for the smallest of resistance efforts. People feared him as much as they hated him. In the war, such figures were not uncommon. There were always men like Schmidt, men who thrived on power and destruction, driven by an ideology that left no room for empathy. Hargrave knew that finding Schmidt would bring closure to a chapter of violence in the town. But was that closure worth the cost? As Hargrave's thoughts churned with uncertainty, the soldiers continued their advance. The sound of gunfire rang out in the distance, distant skirmishes between the British forces and the remaining Nazi holdouts, remnants of the shattered war machine. The village itself, however, appeared deserted, the houses silent, their windows shuttered tight. The people of Annenberg had long since learned to avoid the streets during military operations, fearful of becoming collateral damage in yet another battle they had no stake in. The British soldiers' presence, though a potential harbinger of freedom, also carried the weight of further violence. Hargrave knew the villagers had lived for too long under the shadow of the Nazi regime to greet the British with open arms. But what Hargrave did not know, what no one in his unit could have anticipated, was just how much the people of Annenberg had already been changed by their suffering. Their hearts, hardened by years of war, had begun to question the simple solutions of vengeance and violence. When they finally reached the town square, Hargrave signaled for his men to halt. The crowd had gathered there, as expected, but there was something strange about the scene. The villagers, though standing in tight clusters, made no move to retreat. They simply watched, silent, waiting for the soldiers to make their move. A mix of emotions rippled through the gathered civilians: reluctance, defiance, and fear. But underneath it all, there was a sense of expectation, an unspoken desire for something that neither Hargrave nor his soldiers had yet fully understood. The British officers quickly organized into small groups, each one tasked with searching specific areas of the town. The plan was simple: sweep through the town methodically, identify potential hiding places, and apprehend Schmidt. But as Hargrave gave the orders, he found himself once again caught between the need for action and the need for reflection. He knew what was expected of him: to give orders, to push forward, to neutralize the threat. Yet, the longer he stood there, surveying the crowd, the more he questioned the path that had been set before him. The townspeople, for their part, seemed to sense the change in the air. There was no longer the blind loyalty to vengeance that had driven them to this point. They had endured too much, seen too many lives lost to keep chasing after the illusion of retribution. Many had seen their own families torn apart, their homes burned to the ground by the very forces they now stood against. It was impossible to forget that in the eyes of the Nazis, the people of Annenberg had always been expendable. And yet, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Hargrave saw something else in the eyes of the villagers: an openness, a fleeting willingness to believe that there might be another way. Hargrave's attention shifted back to the task at hand. A soldier approached, bringing news of a possible sighting of Schmidt in a nearby house. The man's face was grim, his steps quick and decisive. There was no time to dwell on the larger questions, no room for indecision. The mission was in full swing now, the wheels of war turning once again. Hargrave nodded in acknowledgement and motioned for the soldiers to move out, his mind now racing with the possibility of what lay ahead. Was it too late to stop this? Could he still make a different choice? As the soldiers fanned out, Hargrave walked at the head of the group, his senses heightened, his instincts sharpened. The distance between him and Schmidt seemed to close with every step, but the distance between what he had become and the man he wanted to be had grown immeasurably wider. He could feel the weight of the eyes upon him, the eyes of the villagers, the eyes of his men, and, most hauntingly, his own eyes, which were no longer quite so sure of the path forward. At that moment, Hargrave realized that this mission, this seemingly simple objective of capturing a Nazi officer, had become far more than just an act of military strategy. It had become a test of his own character, of his ability to separate the man he was from the machine he had become. The cold logic of war no longer made sense to him in the same way it once had. He had witnessed the brutality of the Nazis firsthand, had seen the consequences of their actions, and yet now, in this town that had suffered so much, he wondered if there was another way, if mercy could, at times, be more powerful than the sword. As he moved toward the house where Schmidt was believed to be hiding, Hargrave's thoughts remained tangled, his doubts growing with each step. The line between right and wrong had never felt so unclear, and for the first time since the war had begun, he could not silence the voice in his head that asked whether there was a way to end this cycle of violence for good. Would he follow the orders, bring Schmidt to justice through punishment and brutality, or would he attempt something else, something that might change everything? In that moment, everything hung in the balance. As the soldiers moved deeper into the village, the air felt heavier with each step, like a storm waiting to break. The march to the house where Heinrich Schmidt was believed to be hiding seemed endless, even though the distance was no more than a few hundred yards. Colonel Hargrave could hear the steady rhythm of boots behind him, each step a reminder of the purpose they had come to fulfill. He had been through countless operations, each with its own objective, each filled with its own risks, but nothing had felt as complicated as this. The briefings had been clear. Schmidt was a high-ranking officer with critical intelligence. His capture could turn the tide in the Allies' favor. The military machine had no place for mercy, and Hargrave had always followed the orders given to him. But now, in this small French village, with the specter of the war hanging over them all, the weight of his command felt infinitely more burdensome. Hargrave glanced at his soldiers, young men hardened by the war, yet still not entirely numb to its cruelty. They looked to him for guidance, expecting the cold, tactical decisions that defined their existence. In their eyes, there was no room for hesitation, no room for second-guessing. The war had bred a kind of tunnel vision in them all, a singular focus on achieving their objective by any means necessary. But for Hargrave, something had shifted. As they approached the house, the one believed to be hiding Schmidt, he couldn't shake the growing sense of unease that had gripped him since entering Annenberg. The village had been eerily silent, save for the distant sounds of gunfire, which still echoed from faraway skirmishes. But within the town, there was no resistance. No last-ditch effort to stop the British from advancing. No desperate calls for a counterattack. The villagers, worn down by years of occupation, seemed resigned to their fate. They moved with an air of ghostly acceptance, knowing all too well that the war had left them with few choices. It was as though they had already surrendered to the violence, knowing it would come again and again, no matter who won the war. Hargrave could see the hesitation in their eyes, but there was no anger. Just the kind of weariness that only years of oppression could breed. When they reached the door of the house, Hargrave raised a hand to signal the soldiers to halt. He could hear his breath, shallow and tense, as if his very lungs were conspiring with his heart to tell him that something was wrong. His eyes scanned the windows of the house, dark and lifeless. There was no movement, no sign of life. It was as if the place had been abandoned, yet he knew better. He knew that inside, Schmidt would be hiding, waiting. There was a certain certainty about it, a cruel inevitability that matched the resolve of those who fought on the side of the Nazis. Hargrave's eyes lingered on the house a moment longer, as if searching for some clue that might allow him to back away, to turn around and forget the whole thing. But there was no such reprieve. He looked at his men, their faces hard, their hands gripping rifles in anticipation. They were ready for what came next, eager to fulfill the mission that had brought them here. There was no room for sentiment in their minds, no place for questioning the righteousness of their orders. They had been trained to execute, not to consider. Their presence was a reminder of the brutal efficiency of war, where human lives were reduced to statistics, where compassion was a weakness, and where survival meant doing what was necessary, no matter the cost. And yet, as Hargrave stood there, the ghost of a decision he had made long before this moment seemed to loom larger. His duty had always been clear, but this felt different. The war had changed him in ways he hadn't fully realized until now. Hargrave stepped forward, his boots crunching against the frozen ground. He motioned for the soldiers to move in, and as they began to surround the house, Hargrave's mind raced. The plan was simple: secure the perimeter, search the building, and bring Schmidt in. The villagers would watch, silent witnesses to whatever transpired. But there was one thing Hargrave couldn't shake: the image of the crowd back in the square. The villagers hadn't greeted him with the fervor of liberation. Instead, there had been something more complicated in their gazes. Something that defied the expectations he had brought with him. In their eyes, he had seen something that unsettled him. It wasn't fear alone. It was something more profound, a kind of questioning, as if they, too, were asking what this war was really about. Had they not suffered enough? Had not enough blood been spilled in the name of some abstract cause? Were they to live the rest of their lives in the aftermath of endless cycles of revenge and retribution? Hargrave pushed the thought aside as the soldiers breached the door. The creak of the wooden frame echoed through the house, and the soldiers moved inside with the practiced precision that came with years of training. The house was cold, its interior draped in shadows. Hargrave followed close behind, his senses heightened as he navigated through the dimly lit corridors. Every step seemed to draw him closer to Schmidt, closer to the man whose very existence embodied the nightmare the villagers had lived through. The walls, though plain and unadorned, were marked with the signs of occupation. Furniture overturned, possessions left hastily behind, as though those who had once lived here had fled in fear. There was no warmth here, no sign of human life beyond the shadows of what had been. Hargrave's mind couldn't help but linger on the empty rooms, on the silent, abandoned spaces that seemed to reflect the emptiness of the world around him. As they reached the back of the house, Hargrave's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a door creaking open. One of the soldiers had found a hidden room, a small closet tucked behind a false wall. Hargrave's heart quickened. This was it, the moment they had been waiting for. He stepped forward, his hand on the hilt of his sidearm, ready to act. The soldier slowly turned the handle, and the door swung open to reveal a figure standing within. It was Schmidt, disheveled, his eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. He was dressed in the same uniform Hargrave had seen countless times on the battlefield, but now it seemed like a symbol of something far more sinister. Schmidt didn't resist as the soldiers moved to restrain him. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, as though the war had hollowed him out from within. He looked like a man who had lost himself long before the Allies had arrived. But it was the look in his eyes, the haunted, weary expression, that caught Hargrave off guard. It wasn't the defiance Hargrave had expected from a man like Schmidt. Instead, it was fear. Fear of what he had become, fear of what would happen to him now. It was a fear that Hargrave recognized all too well, a fear of being consumed by the very thing one had once fought to create. As the soldiers took Schmidt into custody, Hargrave found himself at a crossroads. His orders had been clear: capture the officer, extract information, and ensure that he faced justice. But standing in that cold, lifeless room, Hargrave could not ignore the gnawing discomfort that had settled in his gut. This man, this officer, this Nazi, was the embodiment of everything Hargrave had been taught to despise. And yet, something in his demeanor, in his brokenness, spoke of a different story. Was this man truly evil, or was he merely another casualty of a war that had ravaged everyone, regardless of their allegiance? Hargrave didn't know the answer, but it unsettled him. What was justice in a world where every side had blood on its hands? As Schmidt was led away, Hargrave remained in the room for a moment longer. He looked around, at the wreckage of a life destroyed, at the fractured remnants of a home that had once been filled with the warmth of family, and something within him shifted. It was then that Hargrave realized something that he had never fully understood before. The war had created monsters on both sides, and there was no clean line between right and wrong. The choices they made, the decisions that seemed so clear in the heat of battle, were far more complicated than they appeared. In this moment, he understood that no one, not even the soldiers who fought for the Allies, was truly innocent. The war had taken from them all, and the path to redemption was not always as simple as punishment or retribution. For the first time in a long while, Hargrave began to question the mission itself. What if there was another way? What if mercy, rather than violence, was the path forward? But the thought was fleeting. The mission had not yet ended, and there was no room for second-guessing. The war was still raging, and Hargrave still had a duty to fulfill. But as Schmidt was taken out of the room, bound and defeated, Hargrave could not help but wonder if the real battle had only just begun. Would he continue down the path of violence, or would he find another way, one that might bring an end to the war's cycle of destruction? That question, haunting and unresolved, would follow him long after he left Annenberg. As the soldiers led Heinrich Schmidt away from the house, Colonel William Hargrave stood at the threshold, watching them disappear down the narrow alley that wound through the village. The sound of their boots on the cobbled street gradually faded, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. The weight of the moment lingered in the air, thick and oppressive, as if the earth itself had paused to witness what had just transpired. Hargrave remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the fading shadows of the soldiers. The mission was far from over, but something inside him had changed irrevocably in the span of a few moments. It was a shift he couldn't quite explain, a feeling that gnawed at him from within, growing stronger with every passing second. Schmidt was a man who had once been feared by the villagers, a figure whose very name was enough to send chills down their spines. But now, as he had been captured and brought before the British forces, Hargrave couldn't help but see something else in the man's eyes. It was not the defiance or arrogance one would expect from an enemy officer, but rather a look of someone who had been broken, someone who had already lost the battle long before the soldiers had arrived. The image of Schmidt, subdued and trembling in their grasp, haunted Hargrave in ways he had not anticipated. The man's fear was palpable, not just of capture, but of something much deeper. He wasn't just afraid of what might come next. He was afraid of himself, of the life he had chosen, and of the blood he had spilled in the name of an ideology that had long since crumbled into madness. The soldiers were quick to return to their tasks, but Hargrave found himself reluctant to follow. He stood in the doorway, still processing what had just unfolded. He had captured Schmidt as ordered, but the act of doing so had left him with an overwhelming sense of doubt. His thoughts kept circling back to the same question: what was the true cost of this mission? The war had been brutal, and it had forced everyone involved to make decisions that often seemed impossible, but this felt different. For the first time in a long time, Hargrave was questioning the very nature of justice, of right and wrong, of punishment and mercy. He had seen the horrors of war up close and had always justified his actions by the necessity of survival, but now, in this moment, he wondered if there was another way. Hargrave turned away from the house and walked slowly toward the center of the village. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. The villagers who had gathered in the square earlier that morning still lingered, though their numbers had dwindled. They were silent now, their eyes wary and guarded. Many had retreated to their homes, but a few remained, standing apart from the soldiers, as if waiting for something to happen. Hargrave's gaze swept over them, and he felt an unfamiliar sense of unease. The people of Annenberg, who had suffered at the hands of the Nazi forces for so long, were now faced with an entirely new reality. The British had come, and with them, a promise of freedom. But that promise had come at a cost, and Hargrave was beginning to wonder if the villagers were truly prepared for what lay ahead. The British forces had liberated many towns across Europe, yet each town seemed to present its own unique set of challenges. The soldiers were accustomed to carrying out their orders with precision, following the chain of command without question. But in Annenberg, the mission felt somehow less certain. It was not just about liberating a town, it was about repairing the wounds of a community that had been torn apart by years of occupation and violence. Hargrave could sense the deep scars that the villagers carried with them, and as he observed them now, he could see the flicker of something in their eyes, something more complex than gratitude. It was as though they were waiting for an answer, but they didn't know what that answer would look like. They had been wronged by the Nazis, yes, but they had also been wronged by the very systems that promised to protect them. Was vengeance really the answer? Could there ever be true justice for those who had endured such suffering? Hargrave didn't know. The decision to spare Schmidt had not been an easy one, and the more Hargrave thought about it, the more he realized how much the choice had cost him. He had chosen mercy, but mercy had never been a concept that war was particularly kind to. The soldiers who had followed his orders seemed unsure of his decision, though none dared to question him openly. They had followed the mission, and now they were executing the next steps, securing the town, ensuring that the Nazi forces would no longer be able to regroup, and interrogating Schmidt for the information that could aid the Allies in their war effort. But Hargrave could feel their eyes on him. They didn't understand. They didn't see what he had seen in Schmidt's eyes. To them, the Nazi officer was just another enemy to be captured, processed, and discarded. To Hargrave, Schmidt had become something more, a symbol of the greater moral questions that the war had raised. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the village, Hargrave made his way back to the British command post. The building was a modest structure, a farmhouse that had been repurposed to serve as the headquarters for the soldiers who had arrived with him. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, the weight of the day's events pressing down on everyone in the room. The officers who had accompanied Hargrave were already gathered, discussing the next steps in their operations. They spoke of strategy, of securing the village, of moving forward with their plans to dismantle the remaining Nazi forces. But Hargrave's mind was elsewhere. He was no longer focused on the tactical aspects of the war. Instead, he was grappling with the ethical implications of his actions. Hargrave took a seat at the table, his eyes distant. His fellow officers spoke in low voices, discussing the interrogation of Schmidt, the potential for valuable intelligence, and the military priorities that must come next. But Hargrave heard little of it. His thoughts kept returning to the village, to the villagers who were still out there, waiting, unsure of what to make of the British forces who had arrived with the promise of liberation but without a clear vision of what that liberation would truly mean. The war had torn apart communities, leaving them scarred and fractured, and now, Hargrave couldn't help but wonder if the British were repeating the same mistakes. The officers continued their conversation, unaware of Hargrave's distraction, until one of them, a young lieutenant named Dunn, spoke up. "Colonel," he said, his voice breaking through Hargrave's reverie, "the villagers are restless. Some of them are asking about Schmidt. They want to know what we plan to do with him. They're concerned." Hargrave looked up, startled. The thought had not occurred to him, but now that it had, it seemed obvious. The villagers had witnessed Schmidt's capture, and they would have expected retribution. What would they make of his fate now? What would they think of a British officer who, instead of killing the man who had caused them so much pain, had chosen to spare him? Hargrave felt the weight of their gazes pressing down on him once more. He had made the decision, and there was no turning back. But he could not escape the feeling that the choice he had made would have consequences far beyond the immediate aftermath. He took a deep breath and stood up, signaling to Lieutenant Dunn. "Let's go," Hargrave said quietly. "We'll address them." The two officers left the command post and made their way to the town square, where the remaining villagers had gathered. As they approached, Hargrave could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, their expectation palpable. The villagers were watching, waiting for something, though Hargrave wasn't sure what. He could see the same wariness he had seen earlier, but now there was a new element in their expressions, an unspoken question that hung in the air. What would he do with Schmidt? Would he execute the Nazi officer in front of them? Would he deliver the justice they had hoped for, or would he choose a different path? Hargrave stood before the crowd, his face resolute but his heart heavy. He knew what they wanted, knew what they expected. They had lived through too much to simply let the man who had caused them so much suffering walk away. Yet, as Hargrave looked out at them, he realized that the question was not just about Schmidt. It was about what kind of world they were all fighting for, about what the future could look like in the aftermath of such destruction. Was this cycle of violence all they had to look forward to? Or was there another way, one that might break the chains of hatred and revenge that had kept them all in this endless conflict? The crowd remained silent, their faces a mixture of confusion, hope, and anger. Hargrave opened his mouth to speak, but no words came at first. The decision he had made, the one that seemed so simple in the heat of the moment, now felt like an enormous burden. He had chosen mercy, but could mercy really heal the wounds of war? Could it undo the suffering, the loss, the years of torment that these people had endured? Finally, Hargrave found his voice. "I know what you are all thinking," he began, his words measured but firm. "Schmidt will face justice. But it will not be the kind of justice that we have seen for so long. We will not become the very thing we have fought against. We must decide, together, what kind of world we want to rebuild." His words hung in the air,